While they're coming up, welcome. Nie rozumiem po-polsku bardzo dobrze, so I will speak in English about serious times. I am a philosopher by training, and I'm going to be focusing on a philosopher and talking about his ideas. And the question is, why bother, since philosophy often has a reputation for being irrelevant, abstract, distant from real life. But philosophy is a serious business. The job of philosophers in large part is to define values. What's most important in life? What should we be striving for? What kind of people do we need to be to achieve the best things in life individually and socially? And as we know, the ideals that philosophers have enunciated over the course of modern history have had huge influence on motivating, in some cases, wonderful, free, liberating, progressive civilizations, but also dark, barbaric civilizations. Karl Marx was a PhD in philosophy, and his philosophy in economics and politics is a direct instantiation of his abstract philosophy. The Nazis, the National Socialists, were largely influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche. Some elements they misinterpreted, but many elements they got correctly, and they thought of themselves as idealists putting into practice a philosophy of life. The fascists in Italy, Mussolini and his co-writer Gentili, were Hegelian philosophers, a great 19th century German philosopher, again thinking of themselves as idealists putting into practice a noble progressive philosophy for the future. So what I want to suggest is, while Alexander Dugin is the most famous contemporary philosopher, despite the fact that you might find many of his views repugnant, crazy, ridiculous, they need to be taken seriously. What we have learned from 20th century history is there was a great battle between several political philosophies and ways of life that resulted in terrible, nasty wars. The wars were obviously fought over for many reasons, but the ideals, as enunciated by the moral philosophers, were a huge part of the mix. Liberalism, capitalism, democracy, republicanism, neo-Marxism, fascism, and so on are not merely abstract labels. They are animating sets of ideals and answers to the question of what the meaning of life is. So here we are in the midst of war. And of course, our big question is, where does the war come from? How is the war being prosecuted? What will the result of the war be? And for that, in large part, we don't know the answers, but we are speculating what's going on inside this man's brain. And one of the things that we know is this man was raised and educated in Russia in a particular philosophical and cultural context. He's very smart. And of course, he has his goals and his ideals. And we do know that he listens and reads widely to many of his advisors. And so when the name Alexander Dugin pops up repeatedly as enormously influential, that's someone that we philosophers have a job to do in articulating. So I want to talk through, and in his own words, what Alexander Dugin has said about the most important issues facing Russia and then facing the world. So this is from a 1997 article called Fascism, Borderless and Red. Now the context here is that the Soviet Union has collapsed just a few years earlier, and we're now back to Russia, and fortunately from the Polish perspective, the Soviets have left. But it's still very early days, and when we have a famous philosopher stepping forward saying what the future of Russia should be. And the title should be quite disquieting, and when we start to explore, we will find out what he means by this. Now, he starts off by reflecting on 20th century history, and says there's lots of political ideologies out there, but really, it only boils down to three realistic contenders for the present day and the future. They are liberalism, first started in the West, but of course spreading, communism, and fascism. So his educated judgment is that you need to choose one of those three. The others have been discarded by history, are not up to speed for aspirations in the modern world. What is fascism to this man? It's one of those words that gets thrown around by many people, and fascism is a kind of socialism in the economic policy. Now, this, of course, is something that seems outrageous to other kinds of socialism, but most fascists will argue that their economic policy is a kind of socialism, but they just want to add other elements to it. So, socialist or moderate socialism, and we're going to subordinate the personal, individual economic interests. And this is a fundamental point, because as we know, on the side of liberalism, one of the core values is precisely the individual. The individual's rights to freedom in all areas of life, including the economic, to choose your own course in life, to control your own money, your property, to make investment decisions, and so on. So immediately, that is going to be rejected in favor of some form of socialism. And we know historically, in general terms, what socialism means. Also, aside from the strictly economic issues, there's an understanding of what the culture of fascism should be. We're not interested in being very humane, nice, respectful of human rights. And of course, we know that's another important characteristic of liberalism. Deep respect for civility and human rights on a fundamental level. That is going to be rejected. We also hate intellectuals, like I guess people like me and Professor Costivo, people who think too much, come up with all of these ideas and so on. It is going to be a much more physicalistic oriented, unthinking, perhaps following orders from higher command and so on. Not too much thinking for yourself about abstracted issues. We hate, it's not that we just like intellect, we hate intellectuals. Okay, very strong language, right, et cetera, and then a little further, the fascist, by contrast, loves the brutal. So we're creating a brutal, not particularly intellectual culture, and that is also part and parcel of the fascism. And we're not going to be very nice about it. Now here, we have a first major indication of the intellectual roots. We admire Mussolini and what he tried to accomplish in Italy and the ideals that animated Mussolini. And of course, Mussolini is the original fascist. And so Mussolini's methods are well known. And so to have the major philosopher in Russia hearkening back and saying, this is the guy, this is an informed judgment. I am taking the fascism seriously. Rise, fascist and proletarian Italy, and the proletarian language, we know that comes a little bit out of Marxism, but I don't know if you know this history. Mussolini was a Marxist, true believer, 100% Marxist until he was 35 years old. And then he thought, instead of international socialism, what we need is national socialism for the Italian people. And what Dugin is going to do is say, essentially, Mussolini is right, absolutely right. We just need to make the alteration. It's not going to be socialism for Italians. It's going to be socialism for Russians. And then that brutal, not very humane kind of socialism that was enunciated earlier. Now, what about, though, the previous history of fascism? It's got a very bad reputation. It's like an insult word, often inaccurately used. So why do we want to rehabilitate a kind of fascism here? And what he argues is to say, well, there were lots of great fascist heroes in history who assumed power and tried to implement fascism. And he names the big ones here: Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, and Salazar in Portugal. And these were good guys, idealists. I admire them. But they made a huge mistake. They compromised on their fascism. They allowed other powerful interests in society, some other political orientations that were close to fascism, some big business interests in corporations and so forth that could get the job done. And so they compromised a little on the fascism, and that was the weakness, right? And that's what we can't do. So this is going to be then, that Dugin is suggesting, a fascism with no compromises. if we are going to succeed. So don't expect that we can deal, that we will moderate, and so on. National capitalism, that is to say, compromising with economic interests of various sorts. Notice the language he uses here. It's a virus. It gets inside your system, it weakens you, it kills you. And he says that's what happens with fascism. No compromise possible with capitalism. All right, now another positive analogy. We were in favor, as Dugin saying, what Mussolini tried to do in Italy. Well, let's look at the other close cousin to Italian fascism, and that is German National Socialism. In analogy to German National Socialism, which was often simply German socialism, one can speak of Russian fascism as Russian socialism. So the Italians have their ethnicity combined to make their fascism. The Germans had their ethnicity, and they called that National Socialism. That's exactly what it is. The Russians have their unique ethnicity, their way, their particular values. Those are the ones that should be embraced when packaged in fascism as well. So Russian socialism is what fascism amounts to, right? But then he wants to say the emphasis is important here. It's not that we have some abstract socialist vision and then we try to squeeze the Russians into it. Instead, it's going to be the other way. There's going to be the Russian way of doing things, the Russian ethnos, and it will be moved in a socialist direction, or socialism will be adapted to that particular ethnic origin. Okay, and then some strong language here, prophetic language in 1997 during this transition change going on in Russia. He quotes approvingly at the end of the essay this French fascist writer, again well known in the literature, very articulate guy, who was hearkening and saying, I see great things happening in Russia, that is where fascism is going to rise prophetically, and Dugin is saying, yes, absolutely, that's us. We need a new Russian revolution. And when we use the word revolution, and particularly Russian revolution, all of those historical echoes are significant in this context. It was bloody, it was brutal, it involved a great deal of extermination of people, and all of that is being embraced. Fascism, right? Borderless as our lands and red as our blood. Okay, so a lot of blood will be spilled, including our own blood, as we are fighting for this perceived ideal. Borderless as our lands, that's an interesting frame. What does it mean to say borderless in this context? Because if we're emphasizing ethnicity, typically the ethnicity comes with some sorts of rough and ready borders as well. But here we have a suggestion that, well, maybe these national borders are not going to be very important, that our fascism is also going to be, once we get it solidified in Russia, expansionist. But that's pushing a little bit. So here are the themes: anti-capitalism, socialism, ethnicity, respect for the historical fascists, no compromise, and then tailored to the Russian ethnic history. That's the 1997 piece. Now I want to jump 12 years. The transition in Russia has been effected. Putin has assumed power. Russia is kind of a mess, but at the same time a power to be reckoned with. And here Dugin is publishing a book, 2009, calling The Fourth Political Theory, and it is a deeper, more wide-ranging book, and this is the book that he is the most famous for, translated into multiple languages all around the world. So, interestingly, he starts off the same way as with the earlier fascism, borderless and red essay. The old alternatives to liberalism, communism and fascism, were overcome by history and discarded. So again, there are three alternatives, but as a result now that 20th century history is over, we can see that two of them were defeated, marginalized, put away. We can't go back to them, they are done. All that's left is really liberalism as the major contender of the time. Now this is an interesting little bit here though, because in the earlier essay he was calling himself a fascist and praising fascism and urging fascism, and here he seems to be suggesting that fascism is over and to be discarded. So that might be one change. So what we then need to do, since obviously from his perspective liberalism is bad, sick, evil, to be discarded, and so on, and if we can't go back to fascism, we can't go back to communism, then we need a fourth political theory, and that's his articulation. I am the philosopher who will then provide this new 21st century philosophy for Russia. Now, he then spends a great deal of time identifying who he takes to be the philosopher who provides the foundations for this fourth political theory. Always approving, citing him approvingly, adopting his terminology, and then tweaking it in some ways for his own direction. And this is important because by naming Martin Heidegger as he does here, he is identifying probably, I don't know, this is a little bit controversial. Heidegger is on everyone's list of most important philosophers in the 20th century. Most people will put him in the top 5 list, whether they hate him or agree with him. Some will put him in their top 3, and there's a large, large number of professional philosophers who will say Heidegger is number 1, the most influential and important philosopher of the 20th century, and Alexander Dugin agrees. That's his orientation here. We can identify the most profound ontological, that is to say, basic stuff of the universe foundation for the fourth political theory, the one particular thinker who did the unique temp, the most all-encompassing, profound, and penetrating study, Martin Heidegger. Okay. Heidegger bitterly hated liberalism, and he did. Heidegger was a Nazi. He was a National Socialist. And that's not to say anything about the quality of his philosopher. He was profoundly intelligent and deep as a philosopher, but he also was a National Socialist. And not just a calm National Socialist, a gung-ho, true-believing National Socialist. And when he came to power in his university, he made a point of getting Jews fired. Anybody who was not enthusiastic enough about the National Socialist program, that person would be demoted, marginalized, or fired. And his private notebooks are filled with all sorts of anti-Semitic tropes, hatreds toward capitalism, and much of that carries over into his published books as well. Liberalism, all of its artificial life, its reliance on technology and thinking that it's so progressive and humane and nice and so forth. Ultimately, the claim here is that that's just an empty, nihilistic philosophy, and we need to reject it root and branch all the way through. We need to return to being. That's an interesting word, the word being. And you'll notice he's trying to put his philosophy, political philosophy, now in a more metaphysical, philosophical context. And when we have the word being, it almost always means in philosophy something more than just the ordinary beings. You know, I'm a human being, you're a human being, this is a being that's made out of wood, and so on. This is to indicate something that is above and beyond, something more ultimate, something more grand. And we might start talking about absolute being. And if we are religious, we might start to add some personality to this being with a capital B and start talking about God or the gods. And so here we have Dugin saying, in some sense, we need to get away from our petty day-to-day concerns with all these small b beings and get back to higher being and ultimate being and phrase our philosophy all in terms of that higher reality. But that's his gloss on Heidegger. He uses this Heideggerian German word, Ereignis, the event. And again, it's capitalized. There's going to be a special event. And it's the event that millions and millions of Russians have been waiting for across generations. And they have been suffering and passive and going along with the negative forces of history, but finally their day will come. This special event will occur to them when it is seemingly in their darkest times, and it will be the end of days. And at that point there will be a rising, it will happen to them, Russia will rise up and assume its rightful place in the world. But again, this end of days language, if we just tweak it a little bit, it starts to sound a little bit religious when we start talking about the final days, judgment days, the apocalypse, and God will return and wreak his vengeance upon the wicked and raise up those who are the good. What we have is not quite that explicit religious language, but the same kind of rhetoric and slightly secularized feeling going on in Dugin. The Russians are special, and their day will come. And when that comes, then they will rise and assume their proper place in the world. Ethnos, that's to say your ethnicity, is absolutely fundamental. And so a description of the unique ethnos that is Russia, that makes Russia special. It's a unique community of language, religious belief, daily life, sharing of resources. It's an organic entity. And this is also going to be an important philosophical point. We'll see a little bit later. He doesn't think human beings are individuals the way Western liberals do. You are part of a collective organic entity, your people. They give you life, they give you meaning, and you participate in that ethnos, and you find your meaning through the ethnos's rather accomplishments and so forth. So, a little bit more about this. Slight interruption. This is to go back to 1994. This is the National Bolshevist Party in Russia, one of the parties that was formed after fall of the Soviet Union. Dugin, Alexander Dugin, was one of the founders of that movement and the chief theoretician. This is a group of the young National Bolshevists protesting outside the Russian parliament during one set of impeachment procedures. But notice this graphically in the ethnography, right? They're wearing headbands, and they are National Bolshevists. And again, if we know our history, the Bolsheviks were Marxists, true believer Marxists who were revolutionaries. The Bolshevik Party was the one that was most successful in effecting the Russian Revolution. And so here we have Dugin as a co-founder of the party that is wanting to resuscitate a kind of Bolshevism, which would suggest that he is then a Marxist. But at the same time, if you look at the headbands and the coloring, to me, it looks exactly like an old German National Socialist type of headband, the exact same coloring, and in the middle there would be a swastika. But it's exactly the same, except the swastika has been replaced with the hammer and sickle. And this is after the fall of the Soviet Union. So there's some, again, strange hybrid going on of Marxism, Bolshevism, and fascism at work here. So, what's his relationship then to Marxism? Right? Is it just another repackaging of Marxism, some kind of neo-Marxism, whatever number of neos we'd need to put in front of that? He wants to make it clear that he is not a Marxist in one sense, the metaphysical sense. So he's rejecting Marxism because it is too focused on money, too focused on materialistic things, that it is not at all spiritual and religious. And so Marxism is going to be rejected, in effect, for its ontology or its metaphysics, as we would say in philosophy. And so the big sin then of Marxism was that it destroyed explicitly people's spiritual religious heritages, and Dugin disagrees with Marxism for those points. But, if I can get this to advance, Marxism nonetheless has a lot of truth to it and should still be incorporated into the fourth political theory. And here we have is that the Marxist criticism of liberalism and capitalism, Dugin believes, is absolutely true. So Liberalism is about oppression of the proletariat, of the workers, about alienation, about exploitation. The entire Marxist analysis of Western liberal capitalism, Dugin thinks, is exactly correct. He agrees with it. That will be incorporated into his fourth political theory. So the Marxists are allies in their critique of capitalism, even if we're not going to accept the Marxist materialism, and instead we're going to have a kind of spiritualism instead. So we propose, and this is an important point, also another kind of agreement with Marxism. Man is anything but an individual. As we know, Marxism is a collectivist doctrine. You are part of the group, part of society. You exist to serve the society, to subsume your individual interests into social needs, even to be sacrificed for the social. And that is also agreed to by Dugin. The individualism of Western liberalism is false, destructive, and needs to be rejected. And liberalism must be defeated and destroyed. The individual must be thrown off his pedestal. You don't have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as the Western liberals like to say. You belong to your ethnicity, and they should use you as is necessary for achieving of their collective goals for the future. All right. This one, I'll just put this one in because of the names on here. These are historians whom Dugin cites approvingly. And almost all of them are giants of 20th century history. And it doesn't matter whether you've read them or not. I'll make an assertion about them, and you can check that assertion. Don't just take my word for it. But Spengler, Schmidt, Junger, and Martin Heidegger, again, leave out Toynbee. So those first four, all four of them are Germans. Three of them are very strong supporters of German National Socialism in the 1920s, explicitly so. The one exception is Oswald Spengler, who was courted by the Nazis, and there are some overlaps between Spengler's philosophy and National Socialist philosophy, but the National Socialists for Spengler were much too optimistic and idealistic. He was more pessimistic and thought Germany was in a decline phase, so he distanced himself a little bit from the Nazis. And then Molter van den Broek, also down toward the bottom, wrote a best-selling book in Germany in 1923 called The Third Reich, and is widely seen as prophetic in identifying the principles and kind of society abstractly that the National Socialists in political practice would go on to try to accomplish in the 1930s and the 1940s. So the point here is, again, we have some significant agreement with Marxism. Right, and we're going to use kind of the Marxist hammer and sickle on our party emblem and so on. But at the same time, the fascism also seems to be strong here because Moller van den Broek and the others up there, with the exception of Toynbee, who was an English historian, all of them are National Socialist friendly or National Socialist true believer historians of the 20th century. And so let's take those ideas from those historians, incorporate them into the fourth political philosophy. Again, we're back to a kind of fascism. And then just a throwaway one. This is a book published in 2009, but toward the end of the book, he's talking not only about abstract philosophy and values and so on. What is this going to mean for geopolitical reality? Are we just trying to accomplish this new Russian socialism, fascism, or whatever in Russia and only for Russians? Or is it really going to be borderless, the way the earlier essay suggested? And here we have a soft suggestion that, well, it's not going to be borderless, or our understanding of where those borders are is going to be somewhat fluid. So, young Dugin, old Dugin, first question, what's different? Well, first essay, 1990s, he's embracing fascism. Second piece, a little bit later, he seems to be distancing himself from the label fascism. In the second essay, he's not only talking about political ideas and practice, he's talking more broadly about metaphysics and philosophy and putting the political ideology in a full philosophical framework, an entire package. I've got religious in quotation. He's using this language about the end of days and the great awakening and the return of being with a capital B. And that's all quasi-religious, and that seems to be an addition to what were more practical worldly concerns in the earlier essay. And we also find in 2009 and since then, Russia is increasingly a special place. They are a special people, and history is going to speak to them and through them more than any other people in the world. Now, same Marxism is correct in both essays. Capitalism is bad, evil. Any sort of liberalism is bad and to be rejected fundamentally. Any sort of individualism is bad, evil, to be rejected fundamentally. Those themes are consistent throughout Dugin's career. And some sort of National Socialism, the labeling changes sometimes, or some sort of fascism is exactly what Russia has for the future. So I want to just end with one final question. I'll give my answer to it. Dugin does bill this as the fourth political theory, that it's not classic fascism, it's not classic Marxism, and it certainly is not liberalism. And the question is that correct? Is this a distinctive fourth theory or not? And I'm going to conclude by saying no, it is not. I will make this assertion in everything that I've presented today. There is not one single original idea. Every single idea Dugin advances, he got from from German fascists, from Italian fascists, from French fascists, and from a German socialist, Karl Marx. And it is a packaging and repackaging of all of those old ideas, but in a strong form. And the man, Dugin, has a good sense of rhetoric. I don't read him in the original Russian, but you can see him speaking idealistically, urging people to think seriously about the meaning of their life and their place in the world, and to commit themselves to struggle against the great hated enemy to the West who must be conquered, and that Russia has a special place in the world's plans for human history. And all of this, we can imagine, will be inspiring to younger people and perhaps older people who've not lost some vigor in their lives, just as they were inspiring to the fascists in Italy, just as they were inspiring to the Germans in the 1920s and the 1930s. Dugin is hoping for a repeat of that history, but with greater success for Russia. So I want to just end with a little commercial advertisement here. If you're interested in more on Dugin, I have a Philosophers Explained series that I publish through my center, and we have episodes devoted to Dugin and specifically, if you really want to drill down to the details, and then historic fascism also in greater detail. So I will just leave you with the thought that the philosophy matters, and Russia's currently most famous philosopher is saying some scary things that for those of us who have some awareness of history starts to look like history repeating itself. All right. Thank you for your attention.